So welcome to Tasting New York, live with the pros. It's a virtual round table discussion by three wine professionals, and what's really cool is that we all have Ontario roots, and this is going to an Ontario audience. The reason we're doing this is for the first time in over 30 years, a batch of New York wine is being released by the LCBO. That's happening as an LCBO online exclusive on January the 26th, with two more to follow at Vintages in the middle of May. So we're here to taste and discuss those wines and bring you up to date on New York. I know we're right next door, but a lot of Ontario folks do not know a lot about New York wine. So this event is brought to you by the New York Grape Wine Foundation, the organization that for years has been helping market the wine industry, bringing tourism to the state and reaching out to other markets. The new direction for New York wine marketing is historic, diverse, bold, cool climate. And that cool climate part will ring true again with Ontario consumers. We're going to be talking a lot about those aspects in the next half hour. My name is David Lawrason. I'm the VP of Wine for WineAlign. I'll give you a bit more of my personal perspective in a moment, but I want to introduce our other pros. We're joined by Sara, a very good friend and colleague at WineAlign, a mother of three young sons, and the hardest working woman I know. Sara, what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, thank you, David. This is pretty exciting for me. This is the biggest release, as you said, in a long time of New York wines. And I think that consumers here are up for a great education on what's available right next door. They're our neighbors.
Okay, and also joined by Paul Grieco, born and raised in Toronto, is now leading sommelier, the general and the manager at Terroir Wine Bar, an all-around wine personality in New York City. Paul, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Super stoked to be here. I think growing up in Ontario, and I'll get into that in a few moments, allowed me to have an open-minded relationship with wine in general. And moving to New York in '91, I was able to follow the growth of New York State wine. So it's great to see my old homeland welcome with open arms these products of my new home. Super stoked to be here.
And that's what I want to talk about now too, is the fact that that era, Paul and Sara, was actually a great heyday for New York wine in Ontario. It was being heavily promoted by the New York Grape Wine Foundation at that point. We had several tastings in Toronto. I traveled to all the wine regions of New York 2 or 3 times in that era. And Ontario tourists were crossing the border all the time for weekend jaunts to particularly explore the Finger Lakes. Relations were actually so good between Ontario and New York that there was actually a proposed wine route that would go from Petey Island to Long Island, a tourism program to help draw outsiders into the Northeast. And there was actually articles written about a combined Atlantic Northeast wine region. So those were the good old days. A few things happened in between. Ontario decided to hike its duties and tighten personal wine importation rules, which reduced tourism traffic from New York into Ontario. Canadian dollar weakened against the American dollar. The Ontario industry was thriving, and then the 2008 recession hit. So after all those combined events, the LCBO essentially stopped ordering stopped purchasing New York wines. But here we are, almost 20 years later, and they're back under a bold new initiative called Boldly New York. So we're going to, in a moment, go boldly and explore where New York wine is today, with Sara leading the discussion on individual wines. But first, I want to get Paul's thoughts on where New York wine is now, 20 years later. And you've dealt with it much more than we have. Paul, what's happening?
Oh, everybody should put their seatbelts on. I don't recall, I guess, those heady early days when there were New York wines at the LCBO. When I arrived in New York City in 1991, we acknowledged verbally the Finger Lakes. We rarely, if ever, acknowledged Long Island. Here we were in the greatest wine market on the planet Earth, New York City. And those producers, one, would rarely, if ever, come to visit us, and two, we would rarely, if ever, go visit them, because given an opportunity to travel for wine, we would rather go to Europe or the West Coast, etc. And we were not very receptive to having those wines on our list because we just felt they were less than. But here we are, I guess almost 30 years later than my arrival in New York City. And I would say in our new millennium that things have gotten decidedly better. I think for me in New York and for most New York winemakers, a line in the sand came when I think it was a Merlot from Len's Winery. They did one of those blind tastings against others, and they apparently beat Petrus. So that became a story, and all of a sudden we had to think about red wines in Long Island. Another winery called Schneider Vineyards, Cabernet Franc producer who is no longer producing wine, unfortunately. They got a score, I think, of 94 in the Wine Spectator. And all these little things started to happen. Word came from 5-hour drive north of New York City in the Finger Lakes, how, yes, it was cool climate, but cool climate to us in New York City was, holy shit, that region's covered in snow 12 months of the year. They can't grow shit. And then we realized, no, we're a little stupid about that. That's not the case, obviously. And things began to shift stylistically to a leaner, tighter model of wine. And all of a sudden, the Finger Lakes was like, oh, you guys make that stuff up there. So the world has certainly opened. Our attitudes have increased. Quality of the wines has gotten better. People making the wines are better traveled and better educated. The equipment they have, the exploration of broader swaths of land has also accompanied all of that. Still a struggle. You know, the problem for a New York State wine grower dealing with me in New York City is that you have to battle against the fact that on any given day in New York City, I have 55,000 different wines that I could choose to buy. So I'm not envious of their challenge. And I know still today a massive amount of their business is based upon tourism. But you do see more and more places in New York City allowing these wineries into their joints to give them placements on the list. And there's certainly greater conversation about things. So it is a very different day to day, David, than it was when I arrived in the city in 91, certainly, and even 20 years ago. It's awesome.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. Sara, so your history doesn't go quite as far back, but you've been to New York once or twice, I believe, and you just had the opportunity yesterday to spend about more than half of your day talking with New York winemakers. So what's your overall impression? What kind of feeling do you get from what happened yesterday?
Well, first of all, a lot of personalities really quickly, and so much diversity in New York. We don't really realize this. When we first set out to write this piece and get involved in this release, we were supposed to visit all of the major wine regions in New York. And that was quite a feat already, from Hudson Valley to Norfolk and Long Island, all the way to the Finger Lakes. We're going to do this in 2 stages. It was quite ambitious. So speaking with these winemakers was also showed the ambition and drive that these wineries have, and the ability for them to ripen vinifera varieties. So I think it's important that to note that there was this revolution of vinifera varieties, and it really came to head in the 1970s. And there's some significantly old plantings, some that actually date back to the late 50s, but a lot of very old plantings, for example, of Riesling that date back to the 70s, which is really similar to what we see in Ontario. So there are a lot of parallels here in what we've done in Ontario and what has been done in New York. But also, the largest growing region in New York, and that is the Finger Lakes, has some serious advantages to the surrounding areas for the growth of these delicate vinifera varieties. And one of that is a long growing season with lots of sunshine, which allows this long phenolic ripening. They can ripen really well without losing too much acidity, but also, so because of the depth of the lakes, they have this moderate climate. So around the lakes, this bowl around the lakes, there are various facets and slopes that are quite unique. And we're starting to see a lot of single varietal wines and a lot of talk even about the idea of cruise and single variety. So that's quite exciting.
Yeah, that is cool. Very good. Okay, so we're going to go into the regions in a bit more depth when we actually taste the wines. Before we do that, we're only about 2 or 3 minutes away. I just want to give our Ontario viewers just a little bit of an overview of what the New York industry is like and sort of how it compares to Ontario. Again, we're neighbors, and this is really interesting. So New York is the 3rd largest wine region in the US after California and Washington. Total economic impact, $6.65 billion. It's a fairly big industry. There are 471 wineries compared to just 200 plus in Ontario. All right. There are 35,000 acres of wine grapes, which compares to 18,000 in Ontario. So it's essentially, the industry is twice the size of the Ontario industry. Both regions, of course, draw a lot of tourists, 4.7 million tourists in New York. And Paul mentioned this earlier, that it's really an important aspect to the wine industry, as it is in Niagara. A lot of the wineries are actually geared more for tourism than they are for export, right? So I thought people would be interested in that. There are actually 11 American viticultural areas, or AVAs, in New York State and some other emerging regions. Obviously, the big 3 are Finger Lakes, Hudson Valley, Long Island. A few other ones have popped up, though. Niagara Escarpment. Gosh, wonder where that is. We have a Niagara Escarpment appellation right across the river in Niagara as well. There is Lake Erie, Champlain Valley of Upper New York, Upper Hudson, etc. Lots of Thousand Islands. There are all these emerging regions as well. And by the way, we're going to get into a bit more of the overview geography of New York in an accompanying article on Wine Line that will be posted early next week. And you'll be able to sort of read a lot more detail about this kind of thing. The other thing that's really interesting are what's emerging as the core grape varieties in New York. Obviously, people are growing almost everything, but as in Ontario, some key varieties have emerged in certain regions. So certainly in the Finger Lakes, throughout most of New York State, Chardonnay is important. Riesling is particularly important and historical in the Finger Lakes. We're going to taste one in just a moment. For reds, Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc have emerged as sort of signature varieties, again, paralleling what's happening in Niagara. And then on Long Island, where the climate is slightly warmer, you have Merlot and Cabernet for some heavier reds, and Hudson Valley is kind of in the middle. So we're about to taste, ladies and gentlemen, charge your glasses, as they say. We're going to start off with a wine from Wagner in the Finger Lakes Riesling Dry. But I just want to mention that, first of all, we were going to be tasting these wines at a grand event in New York City at the end of March, which of course had to be canceled. And Sara was going to take her trip through the regions after that. So instead, she has conducted this virtual road trip and met all the winemakers. So we're going to ask Sara to lead off the discussions, and then Paul, you and I can kind of jump in whenever we want to do that. So Sara, take it away with the Wagner Riesling.
Sorry, this is the 2017 Wagner Riesling and that we're tasting, and this is a dry Riesling, which is important because Wagner does produce several different levels of sweetness. And so consumers aren't questioning at the back of the label, and you find this regularly now on New York wines, whether they be white or red or regardless of the variety. And this is the IRF, the scale, the sugar scale between dry and sweet. And this one is quite dry. Now I think it's very fitting that the Riesling that we're tasting today is from Wagner, because they have the largest plantings of Riesling in the state, and they have over 60 acres of Riesling planted. Half of that they use, and half of that they sell to 30 wineries throughout New York. So they do have a significant impact on Riesling in the state and the type of Riesling that is grown. So I spoke to John, who's the son of Bill, who founded the winery and planted Riesling as early as 1978. And some of that vineyard is still in production today. So you do have some significant pedigree here when it comes to Riesling and tasting this. This is a winery that's 100% estate fruit, and they're really, really proud of that, especially because that is not quite common in New York to have 100% estate grown fruit. And luckily, the wines that we're going to be tasting today, most of them are 100% estate grown fruit, which means that they have real ability to control the final product, this vertical integration. So we're tasting from 2017. And to give you a little bit of background on this vintage, this was a really wet and particularly cool growing season. And this was harvested quite late into the year. In fact, John was telling me that they didn't get their summer until the fall. So in September and October, they finally got some sunny conditions. And because of the latitude of New York, you have these really, really long growing days. So this winery is actually located on Seneca Lake, which is quite important because it's the deepest lake within New York's Finger Lakes. And their property is located right at the deepest point of Seneca Lake. So they're actually one of the warmest spots, and they're in the east. And the east part of Seneca Lake is actually one of the warmest spots. So they do have the ability to ripen. So for them, their plot in 2017, it was a great advantage that they were on the east side, allowing them to ripen a little bit more and to round out this wine.
Okay, so Paul, I hear you know a bit about Riesling. It's almost your middle name. So what do you think of this one?
Well, I'll work my way into that
Okay.
specificity. I think all of us Riesling lovers look at New York State and think it is the Riesling promised land in the United States. And to some extent, that is true. And we try and narrow down the conversation to say, okay, New York State can make this style, Germany makes that, Austria makes that, Alsace, blah, and on we go, including Ontario, of course. And as a friend from the Finger Lakes actually told me, and it summarizes the world of Riesling oh so perfectly, the glory of Riesling is the multiplicity of styles, and the problem of Riesling is the multiplicity of styles. So the Finger Lakes, if we're trying to narrow it down, impossible, because like Germany, they do it all. So thank God on this Wagner label, they wrote dry. So we know what the hell we're getting. I do fall into that camp of people who say that, and state proudly, New York State is Riesling. No disrespect to the other goddamn grapes we're going to drink shortly, but I think Riesling is it. There is a poignancy, a linear quality, a filigreed quality to these Rieslings that I gravitate towards. It is long and lean and mean and pure and crunchy acidity on the palate of the 11 Great Lakes, and goddamn, I hope there's 11, or the 11, not Great Lakes, Finger Lakes.
Finger Lakes.
Seneca Lake, as Sara said, is the deepest on both the east side and the west side. Some different climatic conditions to allow different things to happen. I think we see the variability of the Riesling grape in the Finger Lakes shine on Seneca through this Wagner Riesling. Kicks ass.
I really like this. This is the first wine I've tasted, or I tasted these wines yesterday as well. I was really pleased by the structure and the balance and sort of the linearity of this wine. Without it being a steer. I mean, it's got grip, it's got tension, but it's not a steer. They've got lovely fruit that the end of the warmth at the end of the growing season really sort of helped build that in. And I think it's a classic. Lovely Riesling.
Well, listen, I'm biased towards Riesling, as you acknowledged a few moments ago. But ultimately, regardless of the grape and the producer and all the other stuff, what I try to gravitate towards at our wine bar in New York is yumminess. And then I should define yumminess. Yumminess means that one sip leads to a second sip, one glass leads to a second glass, one bottle leads to a second bottle. And hopefully, while you were listening to Sara's awesome commentary about the region in general, and David's very, very high professionalism, you saw me taking a lot of goddamn sips, people.
Yep.
I love it is
Good stuff.
yummy. So.
It's tense, it's nervy, it's what Riesling should be. And I think achieving that sweet spot in Riesling is so important. And
did you just use the S word?
Yes.
You can't use the S word.
Sweet.
No.
Come on, this is the only variety that I use the S word in, and because it's great. It's great, and you know, we think of dry Riesling, right, as being completely dry, 0% sugar, but most of the time there's a little bit of residual sugar, and you know, 4 grams per liter. Even if you put 4 grams per liter in Riesling, you can't tell that there's any sugar in it at all due to the naturally high acid. So there is a range, even within dry, there's a range of residual sugars. And if you get that right mark for the amount of acid that's there, it is a little bit rounder and less like abrasive, you know, and it's more appealing.
Yes,
Okay,
I think
excellent.
I was just going to add in, I'm sorry,
Sure.
David, that historically, even back when I arrived in 91, Riesling was the conversation for the Finger Lakes. And I think a lot of the wines back then were too lean, too mean, it was a scorched earth policy on the palate. And what we see now, climate change having a benefit here, a longer growing season, greater ripeness, better folks there making better wine and taking greater risks, especially with these Rieslings. And I think the conversation of New York State Riesling is not a localized conversation or a national conversation. It is a worldwide Riesling conversation that when we do talk about Germany, Austria, Alsace, Australia, Ontario, we're also including New York State in that. And that's great.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go on to our next wine, a white, a Chardonnay, and from a fairly small winery I gather called Hosmer, which I had not visited before, so they must be fairly new. Sara, what can you tell us about Hosmer and the Chardonnay?
Right, so Hosmer really focuses on vinifera varieties, and Chardonnay is a specialty. And this is interesting in a region that really focuses on, in terms of white, on Riesling. And this is, you know, this could be, it's coming back now, Chardonnay, but for a long time, you know, we were looking for more interesting varieties that we hadn't tasted before in whites. So I think it's a bold move to go really classic and with an emphasis on this Chardonnay vinifera variety. In fact, they produce 95% vinifera here. So they're located somewhere different on one of the other lakes, not Seneca, but Cayuga Lake. And here their vineyard, they're all estate. It's the Patrician Verona Vineyard. To give you an idea of where Cayuga Lake is, it's about 30 minutes drive from Ithaca, which we all know for most of us from Ontario driving through New York, especially to New York City, we pass by there. So here we have some heavier soils, and this isn't uncharacteristic of the region, but they tend to have even heavier soils, but softer slopes than they do have in Seneca. In the end, we have really slow ripening and a really, really slow decline in acid. So unless there's an issue with frost, most winemakers will let their grapes hang on the vines. It's quite reminiscent of Germanic style. A few comments about this wine in particular is that I noticed that it had such fresh acid, a lot of verve, similar kind of energy to a Riesling actually. And so when I spoke to Julia Hoyle, who's the winemaker, and she said that she often actually treats her Chardonnays like Riesling. So she does do a significant cold soak, for example, which she does in Riesling, and she does really minimal barrel aging. So you may not actually taste any wood influence in this wine, and that's because it's really minimal. So we're talking, 15% barrel ferment. We're talking about really, really low in terms of élevage and barrel as well, too. She's a really interesting figure, and I think the personality behind the wine is just as or more important than the wine itself. And Julia is young, has a fresh perspective. She studied at Cornell, and then she went to Adelaide to study as well, too, coming back and bringing a really fresh perspective of wine. And one that looks at acid and the importance of it, and the importance of minimal oak in wines that are a little bit lighter from cooler climate like New York and Finger Lakes.
Okay, excellent. Paul, what do you think?
I drink Chardonnay is about as often as I watch Godfather 3 more than once, which is never. And I fall into the camp of those who accuse Chardonnay of being a white canvas, that it allows winemakers to do whatever they want to it. And it's a perfect grape for that because it can be anything you want to be. I also fall into the camp of those who accuse all Chardonnays of being over oaked all the time. And on that note, as Sara said, I think the best thing we can do is tell people that this wine only sees oak when it passes by it from about 100 yards away, because in the glass, there is no oak at all. And you are hopefully not recording right now, because I will go on record as saying, I actually like this Chardonnay, because it does play, once again, if you don't mind me riffing on you, Sara, like a Riesling in the glass. It's bright, it's leaner, it's tauter. If people want a lighter white wine with good underlying acidity and a pretty fruit nose, which I think we all like to drink every goddamn day, this Chardonnay plays in that way. A little bit more weight, certainly, than the Riesling as expected, but great balance. And it goes on the palate. This could be the prototypical cold climate Riesling made with a deft hand. I love it.
Yeah, I agree. I kept searching for oak. It felt like there might be oak because there's some body to the wine, but I really couldn't taste it. And I think it used just enough to kind of enrich the wine a little bit. The acid's great, as you both mentioned. Whenever it comes to, I thought it was unoaked, so I immediately started to compare to Chablis. It's kind of like Chablis, but not really, maybe not quite as mineral as Chablis, and a bit more weight. But for this style of Chardonnay, I'm really pleased with it. It's a lovely wine. She's done a good job.
Yeah, I know we quickly move to that when we get an unoaked Chardonnay, we say, oh, it's Chablis-esque. No, there's nothing Chablis-esque about this one at all. This is New York State Chardonnay that was made by a wine grower, not a wine maker. And
Totally.
That alone, round of applause.
Good. Okay, so we're going to take off into rosé now, and then we've got 5 reds after that. And I'm very sort of curious and interested by the fact that so many reds have been chosen for this release at the LCBO. Anyway, let's move to the Rosé Sheldrake Point Dry Rosé 2019, brand new. Sara?
Right. It's very, very fresh and young, and this is 100% Cabernet Franc, which is one of those other varieties that does really, really well. And I think that if you think of any 2 varieties that are grown in New York State, it's Riesling and it's Cabernet Franc. And this is 100% Cabernet Franc. And once again, I'm really glad that we're trying a benchmark example of rosé. This is from Sheldrake, who specializes and considers rosé their flagship wine. In fact, half of their production is rosé, dry rosé, this dry rosé. And, you know, not a big winery, but a winery that really loves this style of wine. And it thinks of it as being a wine that you can drink year round, not just fresh poolside summer. So it takes the rosés seriously, you know, and I think of Tabal in France when I think of a wine region that takes the rosés seriously, only producing rosé. So I spoke to David Breeden, who's the winemaker here, and he's also the winemaker at a subsequent wine that we're going to taste today. He is a man of very few words. He's a chemist by background, having 2 degrees in chemistry and philosophy as well too. But in his words, he's minimalist, and he's definitely minimalist in his style of wine. We often think of rosé as being a very technical wine, especially when we think of Provençal styles of rosé, but this one isn't. He wants to be as simple as possible in making his rosé, and he does one, and he does it right, and he's been finessing it since 2000, and they've gotten to the perfect formula that they believe. So this, as you can tell, is not a very pale rosé, but it's also not a very dark rosé. And generally he does just an overnight soak. But this vintage was particular, 2019. So he had to make it actually a little bit more technical, probably as technical as he gets with these wines, and had to do a longer several day cold soak in order to lessen the acid. It was such a high acid year. The longer you cold soak, the more the acidity drops. So he did a lot of work in the cold before he even started fermenting this wine. One quick note too is that this is a really sustainable winery that uses both geothermal and solar energy for the majority of their winemaking process. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, Paul, take it away.
I will not be in the camp of people who love rosé. I go from red wine to Riesling and then back to red wine as my year progresses. So when I do drink rosé, I think of them along the lines of, is this a rosé that is more like a white wine, or is this a rosé that is more like a red wine? And the ones that are more like the red wine, you can tell if only from the color alone, but in terms of the body, the richness of that. I gravitate, as is my Riesling wont, to the lighter, more brisk styles of rosé. That if I was blinded, I would think that I was almost drinking a white wine. But what I love about this one, and the rosés that tend to be in my fridge, is that there is a little bit more of a structural profile to the wine, that not only am I getting the acid up front, but I'm getting a little bit of that tannin in the back of the palate, a little more weight that gives it a little bit more lift, and a little bit more length. So with some of those summer or late spring, summer barbecue foods that I don't want to drink a big buxom red, that I want something with lightness but still enough heft, that Sheldrake Rosé kicks ass.
Yeah, I'm really loving it too. I often find rosés frankly boring. I do like ones that tend to be made from single red varieties, where you actually pick up some of the varietal character. And to me, this is spot on Cab Franc. It's got this lovely sort of red currant fruit, slightly herbal, grapefruity. It could only be made from one grape variety. And that's what I love about this. And very, very zesty. And I would drink this all year. Love it. Okay, ready for some reds?
Yes.
Change the glass here. So we're going to move into our first red, a very curious wine, and I'm going to be very interested to see, Sara, what they have said about it. It's from Channing's Daughters on Long Island. It's their Rosso Fresco. And it just sort of held me to the glass for a long time. It was a very curious, interesting wine that I ended up liking quite a lot. Sara?
So this is a fresh red wine, and that's exactly what it translates to, and inspired by the lighter bodied, crunchy red wines of the world that not only lighter in body, but also in color. And the winemaker, if you've ever met James Christopher, he is a force to be reckoned with. He makes wines the way he wants to make them. He makes wines that he likes to drink, and he's a real true wine geek. So he's really inspired by a lot of Italian style wines. To me, when I first tasted this, if I were to taste it blind, I would maybe think Frappato as where I'd be going with this. So this fresh red blend they make every year, but it changes the grape varieties in it. So this is a mix which might seem like kitchen sink, but actually is really, really well thought out. So in here you have Merlot, you have Cabernet Franc, you have Blaufränkisch, and you have Dornfelder. All of those varieties represented, and together they come across as something really peppery, aromatic. Oak is definitely not at all front and center in this wine. The idea when I first tasted it, it was chilled, and because it came right out of the trunk of my car when I tasted it, and it was perfect. It was perfect, slightly chilled. And this is what Christopher was saying too. This is a great wine to be chilled. But in terms of food, I love the versatility of this, because right now we're all cooking at home. We're we're not going out to dinner. And as much as you could put this at a fine dining, white tablecloth restaurant, you could also really enjoy this at home on its own, or with whatever humble foods you can make from the groceries in your refrigerator, because you can't get a grocery delivery for another week. So I love this about it. And I just want to mention one quote that Christopher said, was that I love paradox in my wine. And I think just in the grape varieties alone, you can find paradox, and then you can riff from there.
Oh, riff on.
Alrighty. Well, I'm still guilty of, when I think about wine, to isolate one trait and go there where I should be after 30 odd years of doing this stuff, a little bit broader minded. But I'm going to hone in on the alcohol level on this red wine. It's 12%. And the way that reflects in the glass is that it is quaffable, or as a certain segment of all the cool kids say today, it is crushable. Now, it is crushable with a light chill. I agree with Sara on that note. But even at room temp, this is crushable red wine. Some days when you get home from work, or you're at home right now, you're homeschooling 2 kids, you're dealing with your spouse in the other room, you're doing 200 Zoom sessions a day. And you know what? Maybe you want a glass of red wine. The beautiful thing about a glass of this Channing Daughters red is that you can have a glass, you could have 2 glasses, and still read those kids a bedtime story and get involved in cooking dinner, plus. This thing is not going to crush you. Now, stepping back from that specificity to Long Island, because I think this is our only Long Island wine.
That's correct. Yeah.
In this group. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to be a grape grower, winemaker, do not buy land on Long Island. Set your sights in Niagara, because the pressures that these wine growers are under in Long Island is insane. The summer storms that whip through town in August, September are insane. I can't speak so much to the soil. It's rather shallow, it's gravelly. They liken it to Bordeaux. Okay. But the weather is ludicrous. And what Chris Tracy and all of his mates out there have to do to tend these vines, to get ripe grapes, to get healthy grapes, is ludicrous. And then Chris takes it one more step by coming up with this witch's blue of a blend, which I think is the only combo of these 4 varieties on the goddamn planet Earth.
For sure.
And I will end with the most important note. It is f***ing crushable wine, people. Drink the goddamn thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I felt about it too. It's got this energy, crushable but crunchy too, and lovely sort of red fruit characters, really delicious. It struck me almost as a sort of a natural style wine. It's in that camp. It's not silky smooth and elegant. It's got a little bit of edge to it. Really like it, and I like what he's doing. I did visit them years ago. I think they were just starting out. Totally impressed by how many different grape varieties they're growing, and just the way they're playing around and experimenting and trying new things. And by the way, thanks, Paul, for the heads up on Long Island. That was a really good observation.
If I could add to it, Channing Daughters is on the South Fork. The vast majority of the wine stuff in Long Island is on the North Fork. A little bit more protection, forgive me, from storms coming in. And I believe all of the grapes for Channing Daughters are not South Fork. They do buy from all over the island. And Sara, when you talk to Chris, they must make like 300 different wines, right? Like
they
Chris,
make a ridiculous amount of
it's ridiculous. So you, people of Ontario, when you do come down to the States to visit, hopefully in the near future, and you get thee to Long Island, if you're going to visit one winemaker, visit Chris. One, I believe he is a master of wine. So the dude is super, super intelligent. And that thoughtfulness, the professionalism, the degree of experimentation that he brings to the conversation of wine in general and in New York is awesome. Awesome.
He's also a Californian in New York with parents who grew grapes and grew up that way. He's a natural performer. He studied theater. He was also a chef in New York City. So he's got this really colorful background. His wines are colorful. The wines are, as you said, natural in a sense. He doesn't like that I know a lot of people don't like that term. I understand. You don't want to be boxed in. Sometimes he intervenes. Most of the time he doesn't. But all the reds are all wild yeast fermented. They're fermented outdoors as well too, under a canopy, and these large vats. So I mean, he's a terroirist. Best way to say it.
Okay, so we're going to move from really modern cutting edge to perhaps one of the most historic wineries of New York State, Brotherhood, and founded in 1861, the oldest winery in America, apparently. Now, there was a bit of a glitch. Paul was not able to get this wine. All the wines were couriered to him yesterday, and this one sort of missed the boat, or the ferry, as it were. And so he does not have a sample to taste, and likewise, Sara was not able to talk to the winemaker at Brotherhood yesterday. So Sara, you and I are just going to take this one on. I'm just going to pour myself a glass here.
Sure. Well, while you pour yourself a glass, this, I can tell you, is the oldest in terms of commercial, continuously operating winery in the U.S. And, you know, it's obviously, you mentioned, Trevor, this is the third largest wine growing region in the U.S. So we think that has to be California, but there are a lot of first and a lot of old alcohol producers in New York State. And
by the way, Sara, I was wrong on the date. It's not 1861, it's 1839. That puts it way, way back there.
Exactly. So that's really, really important. And so they have some really old Pinot Noir vines. And depending on where you are in New York, Pinot can grow better than Cabernet Franc, and is really, really site specific here. And early on, there was some really great establishment of those areas that were more focused on Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc. And we think of slopes as well when we think of New York wines. Those wines that are closer to lakes, that are less winter hardy, and Pinot Noir tends to be actually a little bit less winter hardy, even though it's a cool climate variety. So you see them planted at the lower elevations that are closer to the lake. Also, you see people using minimal oak. People are really pulling back from oak if they ever thought it was a trend. One of the things I love about New York wine is that there's not this emphasis, not this reliance on wood to define the wines and to give them this impression of power.
My impression on this wine, it actually pours very pale in the glass, with a pale garnet, looks quite evolved. There are a lot of wineries in Ontario and again in New York, sort of in cooler climates, sort of going to this style of Pinot, which maybe is more Burgundian, I'm not sure, but to me it's a bit more traditional. It's not a berryish, floral, toasty style of Pinot Noir. It's a little bit more savory, earthy, tobacco-y, that kind of thing. And I did find, so I've actually had the chance to taste these wines yesterday, and in some cases I'm retasting from the same bottle today. And this wine has improved a great deal, actually, with 24 hours aeration. At first, I thought it was over oaked, but it is. It's all settled. The fruit has come out a bit more, some floral notes in it, peppery notes, and it's actually very, very good. I think it's the best Brotherhood wine I've ever tasted. Have you had a chance to taste it there, Sara?
Yeah, I did. And I found the same thing, and I waited because I had an open bottle to see, because I thought that the fruit was of such high quality that it was worth seeing if the oak would integrate a little bit further, and it did. So this is one of those Pinots I actually would hang on to in bottle or decant for a little bit of time. And I know some is this issue of, should we decant Pinot Noir? No, we shouldn't. And some believe that any red wine decanted, there are benefits to it. And for me, I'm in the mid-ground. I think it depends on the wine. And in this particular Pinot, this is one of those Pinots, the rare Pinots, that I actually would decant. I think it really benefits from it. So this is to me a curious wine. It's modern, but it's definitely got Burgundian influence. If you look at the level of alcohol, which is at 13%, you know, not pushing the envelope, as in some other wine regions and wineries. The color is super pale. This is a wine you need to give a chance with some air to develop.
Yeah, Good. Okay, now this is one of the wines, folks, by the way, that is coming out 2 vintages in the middle of May. So it's not on the Sunday online release. This is one you'll be able to go into the stores and pick up in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So we have another Pinot with us. It's from Finger Lakes also. By the way, Brotherhood is in the Hudson Valley. This is, the next one is from Constantine Frank, very historic property. And I'm just going to pour a glass here.
So this is a very old historic vineyard of Pinot Noir. So when we're tasting Pinot from Finger Lakes, I think it's a great, if we're going to taste anything from Constantine Frank, who's one of the biggest names, and for us in Ontario, this is the name that we know best from the region. I think it's important that we're tasting this Pinot Noir because they have the oldest block of Pinot Noir second oldest in America that dates back to 1958.
Wow.
So that's pretty incredible. And it's a winery that's known for starting this vinifera revolution. So Dr. Constantine Frank came originally from the Ukraine, but not until he, in his middle age later in life, and he became a phenomenon in Eastern Europe as a winemaking consultant, one of the very first, I'm sure, kind of flying winemaking consultants, or at least in that spirit, and then came to New York City when he was 52, found a really great spot in Finger Lakes, and the story is that he picked up this handful of dirt, and this is there's a lot of shale in this site, and he said, "This is good soil," and that was the start of all of it. So this is a wine that comes from 2 locations. And extremely old vines, as I just mentioned. 60% of it comes from Keuka Lake, and then 40% comes from their Seneca estate. And I'd like to just say hello to Megan Frank, the winemaker and descendant of this family, who studied viticulture and has a real passion for her family's history, but I think puts a modern stamp on the wines, and I think it's really apparent in this particular wine.
Yeah, Paul, join us. How do you feel about Pinot?
I'm sorry I missed you on the last round. An outcast.
All right.
But, how do I feel about Pinot? Well, going back to some of the earlier things I said about the Finger Lakes being Riesling central in America, it took me a long time to think about red grapes up there and what they would plant. But of course, we went to the mothership, Germany. We look at the R region, and damn well, if they can grow Pinot Noir up there and have been doing that for roughly 400 odd years, then lo and behold, Finger Lakes can grow Pinot Noir. I will pause on that and raise my glass to Dr. Constantine Frank, who, along with Herman Wiemer and Charles Fournier, are the 3 individuals who really brought vinifera, a European mindset, to this region. And what we are achieving today, we owe it to these 3 individuals for that. So, in a glass. It is a very cooler climate Pinot Noir in terms of how lean this is. It leads with structure, less on the nose. The nose does seem to be very muted right now. Just open the bottle. I think, as you both said about the Brotherhood, this could use some aeration to allow a little bit more stuff to come out of it. On the palate, there is some compactness that I think needs a little bit of agitation to come up. Definitely, and Julia, you may have, Sarah, you may have said this, in terms of the winemaking, how much time did this spend in oak?
It actually has a pretty light-handed touch on here. And I'm looking at the fermentation. So it did spend 18 months of aging in 2 to 4-year-old oak barrels. So this is not a new French oak at all. It's older oak, 2nd, 3rd, 4th fill.
Gotcha. It doesn't lead with an overwhelming amount of oak, but the oak is very much there, giving it structure and presence. A delicate wine. It reads New World Pinot Noir without, at least in the U.S. terms, some of the big over-extracted Pinots that we see from our West Coast. A Pinot Noir meant for the table, meant to go with food.
I love this. This was actually, I think, my favorite wine. Well, the Riesling was up there too, but of the reds, this was my personal favorite. Everyone has their preferences. And I just opened a bottle now too and agreed that it's a little closed. The reason I had to open the bottle is that I drank the whole other bottle last night because I liked it so much. But this is, you're right, Paul, this is a bit more in the modern style, which to me means the fruit's a bit more obvious. But again, it's not Oregon, it's not California. It's not Australia. It's not any of those things. It's still cool climate. Love sort of the cran raspberry fruit, slightly floral notes, very gentle wood spice. It's compact. It's really well balanced, and the length's very good. So a really complete Pinot. Well done, Constantine Frank. Okay, on to, God, we're almost there, guys. We have two more to taste, and we're into Cabernet Franc. And I have to open this bottle. We're going to do Boundary Breaks, which is such an interesting name for a winery. Sara, did they tell you how they came up with that name at all?
Yeah. So the region, and some of you geology buffs may appreciate the fact that the region was formed by glaciers, and the melting of these glaciers created these deep gorges, which are the Finger Lakes. But there are also breaks in the landscape. And on their southern and northern fronts, the winery is bound by these breaks. So I'd like to mention this winery or this winemaker who did not come from a winemaking background at all. In fact, came from a completely different world. And 12 years ago, Bruce Murray tasted a fantastic Riesling that changed his impression of wine, and so started planting a lot of Riesling, and this is their flagship grape variety. But also has a deep respect for Cabernet Franc. It's his second most prized variety. So they now have about 40 acres planted, him and his wife, and they've started, really great appreciation, and always knew that this site was really special for Riesling, but also for Cabernet Franc they're seeing. These wines here are produced by David, who made the Sheldrake Rosé that we just tasted. So once again, this chemistry background, very frank, wants wines to be as simply made as possible. Not necessarily a natural winemaker, but somebody who believes that, you don't do things unless they need to be done. So this is a wine that spent just about 10 months in French oak, but nothing new. 2 to 3 year old barrels. Once again, a really gentle hand in oak. And this is a theme I think that we're seeing throughout New York, this style. In terms of vineyard, they work really sustainably. They don't use herbicides, pesticides. They're really concerned about erosion, the way that a lot of these sloping vineyards are concerned about in New York. So, love to hear what you think.
All right, Paul?
I would never walk away from an open bottle of a Cab Franc dominated Saint-Emilion. But when it comes to Cab Franc, I beat a path to Loire Valley. And appellations like Chinon, Bourgogne, Saumur, St. Nicholas de Bourgogne, etc. I love those wines all the year long. And if I'm going to drink a Cabernet in the summer, with all due respect to Cabernet Sauvignon, it's probably going to be a Cabernet Franc, because there seems to be a lightness, a brightness, dare I say it, a Riesling-esque quality about this grape if planted in the right conditions. And for me, Loire Valley Cab Francs are more terroir driven than they are fruit driven. But we're in upstate New York, and I got to tell you, I was slow on the pickup for Cabernet Franc in the Finger Lakes. I thought it was going to be other varietals, some Germanic, Pinot Noir, that were going to be the signature red of this region. And over the last decade, what we have seen in multiple expressions is that Cabernet Franc is, dare I say it, the shit in the Finger Lakes region. There is a perfect Loire-esque sense of place. It leads with more earth-driven aromatics and that structure, but it is combined with a beautiful red fruit spiciness. It is eminently quaffable, though a little bit more structured than that Channing Daughters crushable wine we had a few moments ago. I think it's damn brilliant stuff.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting. Cabernet Franc has really seen not even a renaissance, because it really was never that well known in Ontario and New York, in the Northeast. But I think it's becoming the Northeast grape. I think it's easier to work with, perhaps more winter hardy, a little bit healthier to grow, particularly in humid climates. And finally, I think the winemaking is getting it. And that means they're not trying to make it Cabernet Sauvignon. They're not trying to make it big. They're not letting it hang too long. They're not over oaking it. They're not over extracting it. And it's coming across as something fresh, energetic, interesting, and has a lot of sort of good florality again, this red fruit character. And this is a classic example. By the way, this is a 2018, sort of again, a cooler vintage. Did they talk about that, Sarah, at all?
Yeah, a little
vintage?
bit about it, but mainly because it was fresh. It seems to have been a little bit less unpredictable than the 2017, but still a fresher vintage. You know, but overall the trend is that these temperatures are getting higher and higher. They're noticing changes in global warming that way as well too, and more extreme variations. But yeah, the freshness is totally apparent in this wine. I love it. But you know, something I appreciate the comments about the Loire Valley. One thing I sometimes have difficulty with, especially in Chinon, is just this underripe character. Just almost too much green sometimes. Violet's beautiful, but sometimes too much green. And in this wine, it's still ripe. It's not underripe. It's light, but really pleasantly ripe.
Yeah, delicious, and you can drink it anytime. And again, even the light chill would work really well on this. So one more to go, and this goes into sort of the heavier school. I was quite fascinated to see it was a 2015 vintage, so a little bit of age on it. And again, a winery I had not heard of before, hadn't visited, did a little bit of my own research, and apparently it's quite tiny. So Sarah, what can you tell us about Fjord from the Hudson Valley?
Right. So this is a bit of an offshoot from Ben Marl Winery. So you may have know of this particular winery. So these are the parents of Matthew Spaccarelli, who is producing the wine for his family's estate, but has decided to go off on his own, you know, to have full control over the wines and make a little different, more experimental approach to these wines, a little bit more modern. Both great wines. So he grew up in the Hudson River Valley. So we're back, by the way, in the Hudson River Valley. And it's interesting. It's a region that's really close to New York City. He was telling me that it's about 89 minutes to take the train from Hudson Valley to Grand Central Station in Manhattan. So, you know, the proximity is there, and tourism is important, but it's a place that's kind of like this garden-like place, hunting, fishing, and he grew up in this area. So he came back and definitely wanted to make wine here. And they've got challenges. They've got lots of challenges. Sometimes it can be really cool. Sometimes it can be quite, you know, a little bit more moderate. And he's decided to focus on Cabernet Franc here, a little bit lower alcohol in this version. But you would expect it actually to be higher in alcohol because it's really more big and flavorful. He also told me a little something about the 2015 vintage, which is way back. Who remembers 2015 now? So he mentioned that it was not a warm vintage, but it was a really long, dry season. So they actually harvested this quite late in order to give it the ripeness it deserved. But nobody's really worried about this in the region because as long as there's no frost, this thing can hold on and slowly mature for a long time. One little fun fact about this winery is they also do Albarino beautifully.
I saw that.
Investigators of Albarino in the Hudson River Valley. It's a variety that he said it's way harder to work with than he actually appreciated, but it's catching on because it has great results.
Yeah. Good, excellent. Paul.
Well, I would say to begin that if I was a somm in Toronto, or I guess anywhere in Ontario, and I was thinking of putting a duality on my glass program, and of course I don't know the prices of these wines for the LCBO, but and I've got this new region that a lot of my guests are not that familiar with, New York State, close but far away. I would buy both the Boundary Breaks Cab Franc and the Fjord Cab Franc, because they're approaching this Cab Franc game from vitally different directions. Both, rightly or wrongly, I'm going to use Loire Valley reference points. The Fjord is coming in as a big, full throttle, Bourgogne-esque Cab Franc to me, more structured, more four square. Where the Boundary Breaks was a rounder wine, this has cornered or squared off corners. And I love the structure and, dare I say, the bigness of this wine. But it's not big like huge alcohol. It's 12.9. The fruit is still restrained. It's compact. It feels like it's about to burst out of the skin. This is a bigger, weightier expression of Cab Franc with balance. And the Boundary Breaks was a lighter, more filigreed expression of that grape with a different type of balance. I want these wines together. I think they're great.
Yeah, this is a much more textural wine. It feels like it's going to be big, but you're right. The alcohol is moderate in it. It's not at all hot. The oak's nicely handled. It's got this smooth textural palate that people love in big reds, right? So I'm not going to call this a big red. I'm going to call it a medium red with aspirations. But a lovely wine and great to see. I love the Hudson Valley. I only spent 1 day there, I think, way back. And we were at a winery, and I'm sorry, the name just escapes me with age here, but he was a producer, probably still is a producer of Céval Blanc. So there's a hybrid grape and growing on very steep slopes on the banks of the Hudson River. And he took us into his cellar and we had some of these fabulous old aged Céval Blancs that just blew us away. So lots of surprises in New York. And I really encourage everyone to not only purchase these wines, but take a trip when borders open up again. I really hope that you'll go down and have a look. That's it for the tastings. Any final thoughts, Sara, on what we've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I love the restraint and energy and verve in these wines. I love the comment that Paul made about these wines that feel like they're bursting out of their shell in terms of juiciness, drinkability, versatility. It's exciting, and I'm happy that as their neighbor that we finally have a chance to explore. And I think for this new generation of drinkers, this has really been their first opportunity in Ontario to really do so. So we have wines here, benchmark wines, flagship wines from producers who really believe in these varieties, and I think it shows in this collection.
Well, thank you very much, Sara. You've done a great work in the last 24 hours, and actually before that, sort of pulling all this together. Appreciate you taking most of your day yesterday with your 3 young sons running around, your husband also working from home. It's been a lot of work, and you've done a great job sort of commenting on these wines. So thank you very much. Paul, any wrap-up thoughts from you, sir?
Well, don't take this badly, but I am jealous of all of you up in Ontario that you have these wines. I think the fact that the LCBO is going to list these 8 wines from New York State, if I was a wine buyer up there, I would be jumping for joy. I think every restaurateur should jump in. And again, I don't know the prices, but there are at least 5 wines that I would want to put on my list. I want to put all of them, but I think if you were to take 5, if you could put a Long Island wine, a Hudson River Valley wine, and 2 to 3 wines from the Finger Lakes from different lakes, you would give voice to the largesse of New York State that, dare I say, for me at my humble little joint in New York City and my peers, that we're not even bloody well doing. So whoever selected these wines, thumbs up, great goddamn job. And I think these wines show new world terroir with an old school mentality about how they're crafting them. And to that, it means balance. And what we all need in life, as well as in our grape juice, is balance.
Well, bang on. Thank you so much, Paul. Great insights, great perspective. So happy that you're able to join us and sort of bring the wines to life in a way that almost no one else in the world does. So thank you, sir. Really appreciate it. And to all our viewers, just a reminder that these wines are now available, LCBO exclusives online. You can order them online. They will be shipped to your local store. You just have to drive by and maybe line up, depending on the time of day that you go. But you can pick them up handily near your own home within 2 or 3 days and enjoy them and share them with your friends. It's a great adventure and really happy to see these wines back. So thanks again, all of you, and drink up. Cheers.
Cheers.